Okay, again, we'd like to turn to Psalm 1. Psalms 1. I'm going to be looking at verses 3 and 4, but we'll read the first 4 verses. Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doth he meditate day and night. And he shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water, that bringeth forth his fruit in his season. His leaf also shall not wither, and whatsoever he doeth shall prosper. The ungodly are not so, but are like the chaff which the wind driveth away. Again, the first 4 words establish the subject of the psalm. Blessed is the man. This is a man that has joy, happiness, pleasure, satisfaction, enjoys God in life, has a fullness of life. And notice it is blessed, which is plural, and it is blessed is, that is, it's ongoing, it's continual. It is, this man is not occasionally happy and has pleasure and satisfaction, but over and over and over. Blessed is the man. It is his joy, his happiness, his pleasure, his satisfaction, his enjoyment of God in life and fullness of life. Again, over and over. Blessed is the man. That is a state of well-being. Blessed is the man. That's the one who can truly say, it is well with my soul. What we read in verses 1 through 4 is descriptive of this blessed is the man. Again, he's a man. That is flesh and blood, like ourselves. Someone who has sinful tendencies, like ourselves. And like ourselves, he's weak. And he has many infirmities. But blessed is the man. So what we read here is possible for you and I that are saved. What we read in verses 1 and 2, again, is descriptive of this man's manner of living. His ongoing habit, his pattern of life, is presented in verse 1, again, from the aspect of the negative, and in verse 2, from the aspect of the positive. And in verse 3, the psalmist paints a picture of this blessed man. And in verse 4, we have this statement of fact. The ungodly are not so. They're not like this blessed man. They are not what is presented in verses 1 and 2. And therefore, what is presented in verse 3 is not them. But, he goes on to describe, are like the chaff. And then this is described, which the wind driveth away. So what is said here of the ungodly also becomes a part of the picture of blessed is the man. So I want to speak on a picture of a blessed life. And again, this speaks for you and I that are saved of a wonderful possibility and potential for each child of God. Every child of God can live this life. So let's look at the picture. It's painted for us in verse 3. It begins with and. So it's a continuation. It's an addition to verses 1 and 2. And he. Got to keep it in context. The he, of course, is the blessed man, described in verses 1 and 2. He shall. That's a word of certainty. He shall be. Okay, so this is a state of being. He shall be like. That is, he possesses the qualities of a tree. And what follows is a description of this tree. So he says, he shall be like a tree. And then he gives us the details of the tree, a description of the tree. So we have this picture. In the background, the main focus of the picture is, blessed is the man. But in the background are the ungodly, the sinner, the scoffer. And they have their counsel, and they have their way, and they have their seat. But in the midst of the background is this blessed man. Blessed is the man. You see, this man lives this life regardless of what's in the background. So he says he's like a tree. All around him are the ungodly, and the sinner, and the scoffer. And he, the blessed man, is incessantly bombarded, just like you and I, with their counsel, with their sinful way, and constantly challenged by their seat. But there he is, a tree. Strong, durable, useful. It's a picture of health in the midst of sickness. The world is sick, sin sick. We live in a sick world, sick society. The world is broken. But we can be this man. Blessed is the man. And notice concerning this blessed man, who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, who does not stand in the way of sinners, who does not sit in the seat of the scornful, but rather takes his delight in the law of the Lord. And he meditates day and night in the law of the Lord. That is, his mind is not focused on the counsel of the ungodly. His mind is not focused on the way of the sinner. His mind is not focused on the seat of the scornful. His mind is focused on the law of God, that which flows from God. That's where his mind is. That's where we got to keep our mind as well. And notice, he is a tree planted. Planted. Doesn't just say he's like a tree, but he's like a tree planted. That means put or set in the ground on purpose, for the purpose of growth. He is a tree planted. That speaks, he's not self-planted. There are no self-made Christians. He's not there by chance. He's been planted. A tree planted. That is the work of another. It is a work of choice by another. It is a work of purpose by another. So there are the ungodly and the sinner and the scoffer with their counsel, with their way, with their seat. And then there is this blessed man. And he's like a tree planted. And then notice by. If you're planted, you got to be planted somewhere. He's planted by. Speaking of a specific location. The rivers of water. Now I believe that the rivers of water coincide with the law of God in verse 3, which is God's instruction in His will, that which flows from God. And these rivers of water is that which flows from God. This blessed man delights in these things. He delights in the law of God. He delights in the rivers. He delights in what flows from God. He has a heart for it. He has a heart for it. Let's just be honest. A lot of people who profess to be saved, they don't have a heart for God. That's why they're never consistent. That's why they don't live this life. They don't have a heart. They have more of a heart for the counsel of the ungodly and the way of the sinner and the seat of the scornful. But this man has a heart for the law of God. He has a love for it. He's gripped by it. He has a deep interest in it. This is not just occasional. So much so that he doesn't walk in the counsel of the ungodly. And he doesn't stand in the way of sinners. And he doesn't sit in the seat of the scornful. And this delight, he's like a tree planted by the rivers of water. This delight that he has in the law of God pushes the roots down to the rivers of God's providing, enabling him to draw life and refreshment from an unfailing source. It is a picture of a deeply rooted life to God. That is what should drive us to verse 1. Because we have a deeply rooted life to God. Some people, their lives are rooted to the counsel of the ungodly, to the way of the sinner. That's where their roots go. But this man, his roots go down toward the rivers of God, that which flows from God. Blessed man. Again, ongoing. He continues to be rooted. And we must continue to be rooted. Our roots ought to be going deeper and deeper and deeper. So the life pictured is a life more and more embedded, more and more fixed, more and more established to the Lord and His ways. Yes, the ungodly with their counsel is everywhere. And the sinner with their rebellious way of life is everywhere. And the scoffer is everywhere. And it's so necessary for the child of God to be more embedded, more fixed, more established, more and more and more in the things of the Lord. That's how we overcome what's all around us. It is a life more and more connected to the Lord, to what flows from the Lord. A life more and more linked to the Lord and His ways. That's why we can't worship today. Because people refuse to break the connectivity from out there. They refuse to. I'm not going to do it. And they'll never worship. Oh, they've redefined worship, so they think they're worshiping, but they never do. They really never even come close. Because they're more connected with what's out there than they are what's in here. We need to be more and more and more connected to the law of the Lord, to the rivers of God. More and more anchored. That's how we overcome the counsel of the ungodly. That's how we overcome the way of the sinner. That's how we overcome the seed of the scornful. By being more and more anchored, those roots just keep growing deeper and deeper. Attached and grounded in the Lord. And his delight and his meditation in the law of the Lord grows more and more. We ought to be reading God's Word more and more. Not less and less, but more and more. And all this in spite of the counsel of the ungodly, and the way of the sinner, and the seat of the scornful. So there he is, a tree planted by the rivers of water. Oh, blessed is the man. And again, all of this is the one who lives in verses 1 and 2. That person is like this tree. So it is a tree planted by the rivers of water. Notice, that bringeth. Again, present tense. It's not brought. It's not shall bring. It bringeth. Present tense, ongoing. Over and over. He bringeth forth. That means you can see it. It's manifest. His fruit. In most plants and trees, the root system is underground. It's unseen. So it is with the child of God. The root system is internal. It's the heart. And fruit bringeth forth continually. It's manifest in his life. Is the result of the root system. And so it is with you and I. What we have here is a tree that bringeth forth fruit. A picture of thriving. It is a thriving life. God's people need to stop blaming the world for their sad spiritual condition. It's not the world's fault. It's the fault of those who profess salvation. It's a faulty root system, or perhaps no root system to the Lord. Notice in Jeremiah 17, verses 7 and 8. Blessed is the man that trusteth in the Lord, and whose hope the Lord is. For he shall be as a tree planted by the waters, and that spreadeth out her roots. The roots are growing. The roots are growing. That's what needs to be growing. The roots. Spreadeth out her roots by the river, and shall not see when heat cometh. But her leaf shall be green, and shall not be careful in the year of drought. Neither shall cease from yielding fruit. And then he goes into the heart. That's another message. John 15, 4 and 5, we read that we have to abide in Christ. And when we do, we bring forth much fruit. It's the root system. Where's our roots? Are our roots going deeper and deeper? Do we have diseased roots? Do we have faulty roots? Have our roots ceased growing? Then notice, back in Psalm 1, bringeth forth his fruit in his season. In his season. That speaks of consistency. Season by season. There's his fruit. His season. It's there when he needs it. Because of his root system. Speaks of dependability. In his season. Again, this is the result of the root system. Many profess to be saved, and they have no consistency in their spiritual life whatsoever. And that's due to one of two things. A faulty root system. That is, their delight is in the wrong things. Or no root system to the Lord. It's one of the two. Notice also, his leaf also. That is, in addition to fruit producing, his leaf also shall not. Again, a word of certainty. Wither. It shall not become dry and shriveled. So this is a picture of perseverance. This tree is dependable. And then we read, and in addition to this, whatsoever he doeth shall prosper. The he, whatsoever he doeth, goes all the way back to blessed is the man, the one we read of in verse 1, and it goes back to the his and he of verse 2, and the he and his of verse 3, and we read whatsoever he doeth. So I got to ask, what does he do? What does he do? Well, we're told what he does. Verses 1 and 2. And all of that shall prosper. All of that shall prosper. That is, it shall flourish and thrive. The truth is, live verses 1 and 2. The truth is, live verse 2, you'll live verse 1. But live verses 1 and 2, and you'll find yourself in verse 3. You don't get to verse 3 bypassing verses 1 and 2. So the result of verses 1 and 2 is a life rooted to God. It is a fortified, stable, solid, strong, fruitful, prosperous, growing, and consistent life. And again, not just isolated incidents. This is this man's life. And it is in spite of the counsel of the ungodly, in spite of the way of sinners, in spite of the seed of the scornful. Just the opposite of what is said in verse 4. The ungodly are not so. That is, they're nothing like verse 3. They have no resemblance to verse 3. Why is that? Because they have no resemblance to verses 1 and 2. Because you can't have resemblance of verse 3 without verses 1 and 2. So, they are like, but, in contrast, they are like the chaff or the straw. The farmer would bring in his wheat crop from the fields. Then he would go to the threshing floor for the purpose of separating the kernel from the chaff. And he would, back in those days, take a pitchfork and toss the wheat up into the air. And the kernel, of course, would fall to the ground, and the chaff would be taken by the wind. Why? Because it has no substance. That describes the life of many professing children of God. They have no substance. They're driven with the wind. Their lives are controlled by circumstances, their moods, their emotions, everything about them. Because they have no substance. Or they have a faulty root system. In our text, there's a contrast between the godly, called the righteous, and the ungodly. Again, these are inward characteristics. It speaks of godliness as an inward reverence. an inward respect and devotion toward God, a reverence for God's character, a reverence for God's law. It proceeds from a consciousness of God. Ungodliness is just the opposite. So it's an attitude of the soul. You get to verse 3 by having an attitude of soul. It's a delight in what comes from God. And our attitude of soul is manifest in life. Verses 1 and 2. With the result being either verse 3, a tree planted, or verse 4, chaff driven by the wind. But there is a stark difference between a tree and chaff. The chaff, unlike the tree, has no root. Has no root system. It has no fixed place. And therefore it's unstable. It just blows around. The chaff is just like John 15, the branch and the vine. The chaff has been separated from the source of life and strength. And it's dead. It's dry. It's helpless. Notice what happens to the chaff. This is stated in the words, which the wind, picturing the ever-changing elements, the ever-changing surroundings and circumstances, driveth away. Circumstances change all the time. But that's not what our Christianity is based upon. But those who have no root system, or a faulty one, they're just controlled by the winds. The chaff has no stability. It cannot endure the ever-changing elements and circumstances. It's under the control of these things. Again, the chaff which the wind driveth away. They are over and over and over, under the control, under the mastery of ever-changing elements and circumstances. And therefore, not dependable, not reliable. Their feelings, their moods, their attitudes, their behavior, all dictated and mastered by circumstances. And they're carried by the elements and circumstances of life. And this is so because verses 1 and 2 are not so. That's why. Oh, it's the way I was raised. No, it isn't. It's because of my wife. No, it isn't. It's because of my husband. No, it isn't. It's because of the pastor. No, it isn't. It's because you don't live in verses 1 and 2. That's why people are like chaff. Don't let people get away with blaming their lives on everything but what is true. Don't let them get away with that, because you're not helping them by listening to the nonsense and them thinking you're agreeing with it. You just let them know right away, no, that's not the reason. You're mistaken. I promise you they'll either get right or they'll stop talking to you, because it's not what they want to hear. But you won't help them by trying to convince them that they're like, oh, poor you. Oh, you poor thing. We need a root system. The simile of chaff, driven and controlled by the wind, really is a picture of a life squandered. It's a picture of a misspent life, misused and thrown away. Now, I believe the chaff in this psalm is referring to the unsaved. But there are many who profess to be saved, who may be saved. They squander their life. They misspend it. They misuse it. So personal examination is necessary. Am I over and over and over and over like a tree planted near to God? Or am I more like chaff carried about by life? I'm fine as long as everything's going my way. But as soon as it changes, I'm not fine anymore. What are we? A tree planted or chaff driven by the wind? Driven by delight in the law of God. It all comes back to verse 2. Driven by delight in the law of God, that which flows from God, or driven and carried about by the ever-changing elements. What a picture we have here in verses 3 and 4. And I pray that we can find ourselves in verse 3. That is our life over and over. Oh, it's not going to be 24/7. We're not perfect. We're going to fail. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about our pattern. What is our pattern of life? And whatever our pattern of life is, it's due to a root system. And all that our roots would just go deeper and deeper and deeper. Again, a lot of preachers today, and I believe the emphasis is all wrong, and it's not going to help. All they preach about is what's going on out there. What we need is to be more deeply rooted. That's what we need. We're not ignorant of what goes on out there. But if we're going to get through it, you got to have roots that are growing deeper and deeper and deeper, bringing us closer and closer to God. That's what we need. That's how we'll survive. That's how we'll thrive in the midst of all the mess and the brokenness. And the world is broken. Society is broken. In every way. Everywhere you turn, it's broken. God's the only one that can put it together. But God's people can rise above all the brokenness and be a blessing to others and live a blessed life. Brother Dave, if you come and